Is evolution predictable or is it random? Had the dinosaurs not gone extinct, would humans exist today? And would aliens look like us? Mammals evolved around the same time dinosaurs did, about 225 million years ago. Yet for the first 160 million years, dinosaurs ruled the Earth. It wasn't until an asteroid smacked into the Earth, ending the reign of the dinosaurs, that mammals were able to flourish. Looking back at this chance and miraculous event, it begs the question, what would life look like today had this not happened? Some scientists, like Stephen Jay Gould, believe that dinosaurs would still be the predominant species of today, feasting on our rodent-like ancestors. Other scientists, like Simon Conway Morris, disagree. See, scientists like Gould see natural selection as a mechanism to maintain diversity of life, to make sure that life flourishes at all costs, and sometimes that means choosing the most convenient solution to a selective pressure as opposed to the most optimal. Scientists like Morris, however, see natural selection as a blacksmith, constantly redesigning and reshaping life to become as efficient as possible in the face of any selective pressure. So what if the asteroid hadn't hit the Earth, killing the dinosaurs? Well, 30 million years ago, the Earth began to rapidly cool. Morris and his colleagues believe that this cooling, which would have created an unsustainable environment for dinosaurs to live in, would have forced them to the equator, leaving the land that was once under their jurisdiction available for conquest by mammals. Given a few more million years, Morris believes that humans would have become the new kids on the block yet again on a separate timeline. Whether or not this is true, it's hard to determine, but Morris and his colleagues point to one natural phenomena as evidence for this: evolutionary convergence. Convergence is the development of similar or analogous traits among independently evolved species. Think of bats and birds. They both have wings and they've both developed the ability to flight, but their shared ancestor didn't have the ability to fly. So flight and their wings evolved independently in both of the species. Another example, more closely related to my interests, is the production of caffeine in dissimilar species of plants. In 2014, an international team of researchers were able to identify the family history of tea, cacao, and coffee. All three commodities that we are very familiar with, all containing caffeine, and they were able to analyze the way that each of those plants produce caffeine. In the team's first step, mapping the phylogeny of coffee, tea, and cacao, they made a couple of discoveries about each of the eudicots. Cacao is more closely related to maple or eucalyptus than it is coffee or tea. Coffee is descended from a common ancestor of both tomatoes and potatoes, but not of either tea or cacao. And lastly, tea only has a very distant relationship to both coffee and cacao. It led researchers to ask the question, if none of them are very closely related, nor live in similar environments, what led to the production of caffeine in each of the plants? Caffeine is a byproduct of the chemical processing of xanthazine. Parts of xanthazine are trimmed off by what are called NMTs, and then it's replaced with new parts. The remaining molecule is why I drink Java every morning. But NMTs don't exist to produce caffeine. We know this because NMTs serve many functions in many kinds of plants. It's only in these plants, and some others, that the NMT's genes have mutated, allowing them to work differently and yielding caffeine as a byproduct. Researchers even proved this with DNA analysis, and they even found that the NMTs in our three commodities, cacao, tea, and coffee, actually all work differently from each other, but they all still yield the same outcome, caffeine production. Thus, we have convergence. The reason for this may be, as author of Improbable Destinies Jonathon Losos says, to each problem posed by the environment, a single optimal solution exists, leading natural selection to produce the same evolutionary outcomes over and over. Conway Morris has even said, rerun the tape of life as often as you'd like, and the result will be much the same. But if convergence is so ubiquitous, then why is it that some species evolve in similar environments dissimilarly? While Morris and many of his colleagues believe that convergence can be identified in all walks of life, Losos is quick to point out that there are almost just as many examples of evolutionary spin-offs as there are as convergent species. Discovered in 1909 by paleontologist Charles Walcott, the Burgess Shale deposit is the oldest deposit of soft-shell organisms ever found. Many of the organisms that have been found and now identified from the deposit have no known evolutionary counterparts. Among these discoveries was, for example, a pre-modern worm that looked like a floating band-aid with like a circular mouth underneath it. Another was hallucigenia. It's a tube-like creature that had a snout for a head, a large weird appendage on its back, rows of spines sticking from atop it, and noodle-like legs. Its appearance is so cartoonish that it made scientists chuckle at the time that it was announced. Conway Morris even said himself, at the time of discovery, that no other living or fossil animal can be readily compared to hallucigenia. Since the discovery of Burgess, descendants of many of the organisms that were found have been discovered, but for most of them still, like hallucigenia, they remain evolutionary spin-offs. So if convergence is so ubiquitous, then why is it that so many of these species are independent in their existence? So let's look at another example, one that could pretty easily live in the riverbed near your house. The platypus spends most of its days swimming around in creeks and riverbeds, hunting down small invertebrates using electroreceptors in its bill, and it slumbers away in the beds it burrows in the riverside. The platypus is extraordinarily unique, yet the environment it lives in is not. The environment in which it thrives can be found in many places across North America, for example. Temperate climates with flowing water, about the same predation, and tons of crayfish to go around. Surely, if you put a platypus in the creek in Louisiana somewhere, it would probably flourish. Yet, it's the only one of its kind existing only in Australia. Surely, if the platypus was a master of its environment, being cleverly crafted over millions of years of genetic selection, it would be found everywhere. But it's not. And that tells us a couple of things. Natural selection may not be as strong of a force as we assume it is. Evolutionary differences may depend on the most minute environmental differences, or there is just more than one optimal solution to any given selective pressure. I assume it's a mix of all three, and as Losos put it, natural selection may work to optimize already existing structures in a species, leading to a chain of luck, a function of which mutation occurs first in any given population. That being said, natural selection seems to be less of a blacksmith constantly forging the most optimal solution, but more of a tinkerer, constantly working towards what's both effective and easiest given what it has already. While it may be presumptuous, it's safe to bet that natural selection not only works towards the survival of the single given organism, but also the survival of its offspring. In Africa, for example, many snakes use camouflage to evade predation, while cheetahs run very fast. There clearly isn't a single way to survive in the face of adversity, but both organisms do hunt very differently. While camouflage would likely increase the survivability of a cheetah just as well as it does a snake, its speed and agility allows a cheetah to hunt much more effectively, to not only survive in the face of adversity, but to also combat starvation, a multifaceted approach. On the other side of the same coin, snake camouflage saves their proverbial hide just as much as being fast would. But camouflage also allows snakes to sneak up on their prey. And it's evident that the best solution to one problem may not be the best solution to all of the problems. Therefore, natural selection may work to create a more optimal organism for surviving better, not best, in the face of multiple selective pressures. And as the debate rages on, many scientists work out in the field trying to advance our understanding of the way evolution works. As we know, Morris believes that you can rerun the tape of evolution as many times as you'd like and you'd get the same result. But can we test this out in the wild? Peter and Rosemary Grant are trying to do just that on the Galapagos Islands, studying Darwin's finches over the last 4 decades. Another scientist, Robert Barrett, has just finished conducting research recently on the coloration of deer mice in Nebraska. Nebraska has very dark, fertile soil. That's why it's great for agriculture, but it also has a lot of very light soil. While still in school, Barrett was working on his dissertation studying the coloration of deer mice genetically, and he discovered that the gene that codes for the coloration of deer mice actually was mutated much more recently than we would have expected. But for Barrett, that wasn't enough. Knowing the genotype of the deer mice wasn't good enough. We needed to analyze this and see this in real time. Unfortunately for Barrett, deer mice aren't kept in enclosures very easily, and he not only needed one huge one out in the wild, he needed 2. His solution to this was to build two very large enclosures out of 3-foot-high 26-gauge galvanized steel, on top of which he'd put another 3 feet of wire to keep out coyote and other predators, and he'd place it 2 feet in the ground to make sure that the mice couldn't dig out from underneath of it. Barrett would build one enclosure on dark, fertile soil, and he'd build one in the sandhills about 30 miles away from the other. For rigorous use of the scientific method, he'd divide each enclosure into 4 quadrants. And because he's trying to replicate a natural experiment out in the wild, to compensate for the average population density of deer mice, he'd need to put about 100 in each quadrant, requiring about 2.5 acres of land. The construction for these enclosures would require about 15,000 pounds of sheet metal at each enclosure. The experiment was intentionally designed to analyze the effects of predation from visually oriented animals such as owls, but it didn't compensate for animals that hunt using heat signatures, like snakes. Barrett had made the decision to try to keep all of the snakes out, but he failed to realize how good of climbers snakes are. The more snakes he put outside, the more snakes he'd find inside. So he settled with leaving the snakes in. Every 3 months, Barrett and his crew would return for the tagging of the mice and the collection of data. And at the time of the publishing of Losos' book, the experiment had been going on for 5 years. They only recently, in 2018, released the report, and it's still awaiting peer review. What they found is much of what they predicted. Light-colored mice were almost 2 times as likely to survive on light-colored dune sand, compared to dark-colored mice, which were 3 times as likely to survive on dark-colored sand. They found the correlation to be very strong among avian predation, given that most other predators were kept out of the enclosures. And furthermore, they found no correlation between moonlight discoloration because owls hunt at night on either of the mice than during the day. The results that they uncovered may seem obvious, but the spectacularity of the experiment doesn't reside in their findings, rather how they found them. Conducting a massive experiment on an actual natural population of deer mice out in the wild, and being able to analyze in real time the way that their genes were mutating the entire time across months of research is phenomenal. So we can see that it's possible to make predictions about evolution, but that's not giving us much credit for how accurate our predictions can be, especially not in larger time frames. Whether you believe that convergence is ubiquitous or not, it still remains unclear if it's the key to understanding the way evolution works. We can replicate short-term experiments in arbitrary time frames, but in geological time, evolution still remains kind of hazy. A scientist standing in the middle of the Mesozoic would have no way of predicting what species would survive and what species would not. What species would look like us 200 million years from then, and which may look like Troodon, a close relative to the Velociraptor. Convergence can also be too broad or too specific. Bats, birds, and pterosaurs have historically all independently evolved the ability to fly, so flight is a convergent attribute. Yet the anatomical structures with which they fly are all different, so are they truly convergent? In part 2 of this 2-part series, we'll talk more about the fate and future of humanity, how well and accurately we can predict evolution, and what this means for the future of life as we know it and life as we don't. Thanks a lot for watching. I had a lot of fun making this, and I look forward to making the next one. I based this entire 2-part series off of this book, Improbable Destinies. The subtitle is Fate, Chance, and the Future of Evolution. It's by Harvard professor Jonathon B. Losos. It's a fantastic read. I'd recommend it to anybody. It's short, quick, only 330 pages or something like that. And if you enjoyed this, make sure you tune in for the next one.